Okay, part 6 of this 6-part six-part series on mind-body connection and emotional wellness, and how it actually, our thoughts and our emotions actually really do impact our physiology and our disease process. And I'm not saying that every disease has a spiritual and emotional root, but many of them do. And so the question that I feel like we need to ask in light of all the information I presented you, and if you haven't seen those videos, please go back and watch. If you can start from video 1, they really do build on themselves so you understand at a scientific level how our thoughts and emotions actually come in, they get filtered, and then they disseminate hormonal instructions to our body to behave in a certain way, as well as behavioral information on how we navigate this world. But for me, all this mind-body talks, it begs a question of definition. Now, go back to an earlier video, like if you've ever walked into a doctor's office and you've got something like real pain, it takes a great deal of pain to get me into the doctor's office. So if you've ever gone there with something that, a complaint that you have, and they looked at you and said, I think it's all in your head, it's psychosomatic, and then you feel dismissed and you feel unheard, that's because it's not in their wheelhouse. They don't know how to treat it. They're flippantly discarding this thing as like, because they can't mechanically find something wrong with you. They've measured your blood and everything looks normal. They've looked at, like in the case of my son, they've looked at his knee and mechanically there was nothing wrong. There's nothing outstanding on all of the imaging they can find that was causing him such pain. And so they might say something flippantly like, oh, it's all in your head, which is the most dismissive way possible to say, is it possible that there is like some sort of emotional, spiritual component to this? It's out of their wheelhouse, and it's out of the wheelhouse of psychiatrists and psychologists too, let's be honest, because you can't treat an emotional issue with chemistry. But what I want to know is, if we know all these things are true, if we know that our emotions and our thoughts and all of the things that come in through our mind that get stuffed into the subconscious are then ultimately impacting our body on a real level, then how do we reverse engineer that and say, okay, I have this thing happening right now. I have this complaint. I have this issue in my body. Can I reverse engineer it to understand what the emotion or spiritual condition was that may have led this path in the first place? And then furthermore, if I can reverse engineer it to discover that, then what are the tools I can use to try to address it and change the trajectory of this thing? Because remember, if you go back to a previous video, thoughts are things, they are matter, they take up real estate. Matter can never be created or destroyed, but it can be transformed into a different state, right? We know that water can evaporate and become a gas, but the molecules don't disappear, they just change state, right? And so instead of being H2O, they're water vapor now, and they behave in a different way, they become a gas. So the same thing is true with our thoughts. So if our thoughts are comprised of matter and they exist in a certain state, we can do things to change the thoughts and to break up, to boil the water, so to speak, so that the thoughts and our condition of thinking moves to a different state. We're not destroying the matter, we're just changing it. Same thing with our emotions. We can do that. Remember, we talked about the emotions are the card catalog, and I'm doing this because, remember card catalogs in the library were long, and pull the drawer out and thumb through them to find the book that you wanted in the section that you wanted. Emotions are how our body, it's the file cabinet, the filing system of our body. So emotions are also things. They are real. They are chemistry, and they are the card catalog of our body. That's how all of this physiological response and everything is stored in our body, is through the chemical of emotion. So those things exist, and they have done whatever they've done in our body, for better or for worse. So how do we kind of open up the file cabinet and take all of these memories and take them out of the depression category, and take them out of the anger and bitterness category and move them into a, let's take bitterness. I'm going to take bitterness and move it in forgiveness, and take this bitterness and move it to forgiveness. And I'm going to take this anger and I'm going to put it over here in peace. And I'm going to take depression, I'm going to put it over here in joy, right? So we're taking something that exists material in this world, but we're unpacking that file so that now, wherever they say anger is stored in the liver, for example, if we can unpack that anger out of our life emotionally, that we're constantly feeding on anger and it's constantly toxifying our liver, and we can say, hey, you know what, I'm not angry about that anymore, I'm going to put it over here, and now I have peace with it, and now I have joy, because at the time I was angry but I realized it was for my good, and now I have joy and I can celebrate and worship, and I'm going to take this grief. Does that make sense? The less that neural pathway of anger and toxicity just keeps feeding toxins to your liver. Now your liver can heal. Obviously, you want to give it good food and stop feeding it nonsense. Obviously you want to do all the things, for your health, but you also need to deal with the emotional component, because you can eat right, exercise right, do all the things, take all the supplements, but if you're still putting that poison into your liver through your toxic emotions, what are the odds that your liver is really going to recover? And I use that as an example. So anyways, how do we reverse engineer it to say, I'm at this stage of life, I have this dis-ease process, I have a complaint that I would go to the doctor about. How do we discern how much of it has a physical cause, right? If you get in a car accident and you break your arm and you got to go and get I don't know, do they even put hinges in your elbow, pin in your elbow? I'm sure they do, mechanically repaired. There's going to be trauma associated with that. That's physical trauma. You had an accident, injury, there's going to be inflammation, there's going to be things. We have tools to help deal with that, but that is something that got broken, and the repair process is never going to be 100%. But the fear that can come in from having a car accident that did that to you, it may not be lodged in your elbow, but it might go somewhere else where your body stores fear. And every time you feel afraid, you're going to remember the car accident, you're going to remember this and remember that, and you're going to remember all the things that made you feel that kind of afraid, because it's cataloged under fear. That's what we need to deal with. But it's different to understand if a disease has a purely physical root or if it has an emotional, spiritual root. And I think oftentimes, it's somewhere in the middle. I don't know what the tool is. Obviously, if we go in, the first thing you want to do is discern the spirits and pray. And the more that you pray and you ask the Lord for wisdom and you ask him for discernment, he will show you and tell you, hey, you have a root of bitterness that is lodged in your left breast and you need to forgive. And I'm saying that because anecdotally, especially women with breast cancer, it's unforgiveness and towards, somebody in their life. And the Lord will show you those things oftentimes if you pray to him, and you can uproot those things. Sometimes you can go to a person who's a spiritual advisor or a prayer warrior or whatever. There's practitioners in this wellness space that do that. But if you can't get your hands on someone who can help you get to the spiritual, emotional root of something, there are other tools that God gave us that I am going to put forward as speculative, possibility that we could maybe use. I think perhaps this is where applied kinesiology can come in. Because sometimes our cognitive mind has suppressed something so far that we don't remember that the doorway to trauma was opened up by something that happened when we were 5 years old. We can't summon it into our memory. That's why I really kind of talk therapy is fine, but you can only pull so much out of the recesses of your mind. The subconscious mind knows everything. It's the thing that helps you navigate through time and space, and it controls all your paradigm and your decision making and everything. And it's recorded every single detail of every single day and moment of awareness since the time you were conceived in your mother's womb. It has all that data input in there in the soul. Go back and watch my video on the triune spirit if you haven't seen that already. It'll give you a really good understanding of what I'm talking about. And I believe that muscle testing or applied kinesiology is a tool that God gave us to help differentiate between what's a physical disease and emotional disease. And then you can drill down on, if you think that it's got an emotional root, what is that emotion? When did it occur? And then you can it's not to say you're going to bring it up to the surface, but there's other tools that we can use to try to go to the root of it and sort of dissipate the emotional charge associated with some sort of memory or some sort of thought process that has been like entrenched in our psyche or in our subconscious for a really long time. I'm going to do a whole series on muscle testing. I'm going to go be getting a good training in muscle testing myself, because I really believe that it's a really great way of circumventing the conscious mind and just going straight to the body that knows everything. It's collected all of this data. It can tell you exactly when you were and what year was going on and what color shirt you were wearing and what was happening in the background of any given situation. Not that you need that level of detail, but the point is that it's in there. And so you can ask the body, when did this thing start? And it can tell you. And you can ask the body what emotion is associated with this disease, and it can tell you. And it can give you enough information that you can then go in and hold the intention, in your mind to dispel this thing and then energetically break it apart. I know that sounds really crazy, but we have tools in which we can do that. I'm just kind of talking about kinesiology as possibly being one tool of being able to kind of differentiate and parse out where to begin in some of this emotional spiritual healing process. But obviously it's always going to start with prayer, meditating on the scripture, do the things that I've discovered, align with God's truth. Do I have any memory of these things? There's a lot of different stopgaps that we can kind of measure against to know that we're going in the right direction, and always, prayerfully asking for confirmation, and then taking note of your body's response to any given thought. Where do you feel it? There's a lot of little breadcrumbs and clues that can kind of lead us on this path to achieving like a larger healing than we would get if we were just purely addressing the physical, if that makes sense. So stay tuned for more.